Hi, my name is Nick Holland and welcome to another House of Bronte episode, and today we're going to be asking the question, why did the Bronte sisters die so young? Hi, my name is Nick Holland. I run the House of Bronte YouTube site and I'm the author of books including In Search of Anne Bronte, Emily Bronte, A Life in 20 Poems, Crave the Rose, Anne Bronte at 200, and Aunt Bromwell and the Bronte Legacy. So I love the Brontes. One question people often ask or ponder when they look at the Bronte story is, why did the Brontes die so young? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to look at death. We're going to be looking at the reasons for death. They say there are two things certain in life: death and taxation. If you Gary Barlow, there's only one certainty in life, to get the taxation. But undoubtedly the Bronte sisters died far too young by modern standards. But was it unusual by 19th century standards, or at least 19th century standards in Haworth? That's what we're going to look at. Now, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, and you're probably aware of it if you're a Bronte fan, we all know the three writing Bronte sisters: Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Anne Bronte. You might know Bramwell Bronte, their brother, but there were 6 Bronte siblings. There were also Maria Bronte and Elizabeth Bronte, the eldest Brontes. I've done an episode here already about the forgotten Bronte sister Elizabeth Bronte, and she deserves to be remembered as well, as they all do. But they died far too young. They died in childhood while they were children at Cowan Bridge School, the school that Charlotte reproduced as Lowood in Jane Eyre. Far too many people died at that school. We know that around 30 to 40 pupils were sent back from Cowan Bridge School at the same time as Maria and Elizabeth. 7 of them died, at least 7 of them that we know of. What a scandal that would be today if that happened in a modern school. They died, at least Elizabeth and Maria Bronte died of tuberculosis. At the time it was called consumption, because the way it consumed you slowly, and then it was a real fire at the end, and it was a terrible death sentence, a terrible disease to suffer, and in the end it would also claim the lives of 5 of the Bronte siblings. Charlotte was the only Bronte who didn't die of consumption, although she may have had tuberculosis as well, but she died in pregnancy. She died from what we call morning sickness, excessive morning sickness today. And today it could be treated very easily, in the same way that Catherine Middleton, the Princess of Wales, was treated when she had excessive morning sickness. They didn't have the know-how or the technology, unfortunately, back then, and Charlotte Bronte died when she was expecting a child, when she was expecting a great joyous moment of a Bronte story, instead turned into possibly the greatest tragedy of all in the Bronte story. So how old were the Brontes that we know of when they died? We already see Maria and Elizabeth died in childhood at school. The first of the four remaining Brontes died was Bramwell Bronte in 1848, and he was 31. And then followed later in the year 1848 by Emily Bronte, who was 30. Followed tragically just a few months later in 1849 by Anne Bronte, who was only 29. And Charlotte Bronte died 1855 when she was 38. And of course, by today's standards, all 6 children, and Charlotte was the oldest at 38. And others died around Elizabeth and Maria in childhood. The other 3, Bramwell, Emily and Anne, around that 30 mark. It's no age at all. It's no age at all. It's such a tragedy for the siblings who were left, for Charlotte on her own eventually, and for their father Patrick, who had also lost his wife many years earlier. So a real tragedy for all involved, just as there are tragedies today every time we lose a loved one, no matter what their age, it's a personal, devastating tragedy, and we have to cope with the grief. But on average, people live a lot longer now. You know, we expect on average people to live into their mid-70s, into their late 70s, heading towards 80. People on average are getting older all the time because of medical advances. But the Brontes didn't, as we've seen. It's around that 30 mark, and people often say, why did they die so young? Was it something in the genes? Was it something in the family? I don't think so. I think we have to look at Haworth at the time in the 1840s, late 1840s. In fact, we do that, we find out they didn't die young at all for the time. In fact, they outlived the average of Haworth at the time, tragically. And we know a lot about this because of a report from 1850 by a guy called Charles Herschel Babbage. I've got some facts written down. If you see me looking down, I've got a piece of paper with lots of facts from the Babbage report. Now, Charles Herschel Babbage came to Haworth in April 4th, 1850, and it was a request of the village curate, Patrick Bronte. Now, he'd noticed how many people were dying in the village compared to neighbouring parishes. You know, his fellow priests in neighbouring parishes didn't have nearly as much work to do when it came to funerals and burials. There were so many funerals and burials. The graveyard was getting chock-a-block full. If you ever go to Haworth Parsonage, such a beautiful place to visit, you can't miss the graveyard. There's a church, there's a graveyard, and then there's the Bronte Parsonage Museum as it is today. And the graveyard, it's very serene. You know, I love graveyards, sounds a bit strange, but each stone tells a story. And they're such beautiful, serene places. But often those stories are terribly tragic. And we think we're about 40, we don't have all the records, we think we're around 40,000 people buried in that churchyard. We know at some places bodies are buried 10 deep. You know, they dug them, put them down and down and down, new bodies on top, new coffins on top, or pauper graves where they were piled in. Because so many people were dying. And I said Patrick Bronte and others, but Patrick Bronte as a priest led the call. He kept writing to the government saying we need somebody to come and look at what's happening. We need a health inspector to examine what's happening and come up with solutions to make Haworth healthier. And after numerous pleading letters from Patrick, the government sent a government health inspector called Charles Herschel Babbage, and he produced the Babbage report. Now, he spent a number of days in Haworth, went around all the village, looked at everything, spoke to people. He set up rooms in the office, in the church rooms, and in the schoolhouse next to the church, next to Bronte Parsonage. And he talked to people, and he listened to what they said, and he wrote a report. And it's an absolutely damning, horrible report, because the situation in Haworth was appalling at the time. That's why so many people were dying. He said, well, some of the facts. In 1850, when he wrote this report, the average life expectancy was 25.8. So already we see it's considerably lower than the ages that the four Brontes who survived into adulthood reached. But in 1848, when the year that Bramwell died, the year that Emily Bronte died of consumption of tuberculosis, the average age at time of death, the average life expectancy in Haworth was 21.7. And Babbage looked at child mortality, which was absolutely huge. You know, more than 1 in 10 babies didn't survive 6 months. 41.6% of babies died before the age of 6. You know, if you had a child, you got nearly a 50-50 chance, a half chance that it would die before the age of 6. It's appalling. Now, one reason that so many people died so young was sanitation. That's a very major reason. Sanitation in Haworth was appalling. For the whole village, which had a population of around 2,500, there were 69 toilets. There were 24 buildings that had no access to toilets at all. Babbage found a cellar dwelling used by a hand loom weaving family, 7 of them in one cellar, sharing 2 beds. And the houses themselves, hand loom weaving was a big occupation in Haworth at the time. They had to have the rooms hot for the weaving. And so the houses were blocked up. In the middle of summer, it's a hot day today, we're only in April, but it's hot here in Yorkshire. Imagine in the height of summer, all the windows, doors blocked up, heat, furnaces going. It must have been absolutely hellish. And in rooms where a family of maybe up to 7 people were living in the room, as well as the work continuing. So the conditions were absolutely appalling. There were no sewers, gutters as we know today, down the big steep Haworth main street, the hill. There were just open channels where human effluent ran down all the time. It was mixing with animal effluent. People kept pigs and chickens in their houses, and blood from slaughtering of the animals. So sanitation was absolutely appalling. That led to constant outbreaks of diseases like cholera, diseases like typhus and typhoid, and that's a major reason why people were dying so young. Babbage identified another reason: there was no fresh water. There were 2 pumps of water for the whole village. One of them didn't work. There were no reservoirs. So it's thanks to Babbage's report, really, that things really changed for the better. 2 reservoirs were built near Haworth. Proper sanitation was put in place, water pumps were put in place. Babbage also recommended that trees were planted in that hugely overfilled graveyard, and he changed the way that graves were ordered and burials were made, because he saw that as well as a major source of pollution that was killing people. Water, rain was coming to the top of the village where the graveyard was, going over the graveyard, which was full of unhealthy things, really. And I'm no scientist, but it was full of really unhealthy atmosphere. The water was collecting pollutants. It was running down the hill to a village where people would gather the water and drink it, and it would kill them. So Babbage said, the bodies aren't decomposing correctly in the graves because of the way the graves are organised, and because there's no trees there to help the decomposition process. So Babbage put that in place, put the reservoirs and the water pumps in place, and those changes made a huge difference. And year by year after that, the death rate started to decline. We know so from Babbage's report that Haworth was on its own stood out even in that part of West Yorkshire. The death rate in Haworth was 44.3% higher than in neighbouring villages like Oxenhope. So a lot of people dying very young. If you made it to 21.7, that was the average in 1848. So the Brontes lived considerably longer than that average life expectancy. The reasons for this: they came from a lower middle class family. They didn't have to work in dangerous occupations, hand loom weaving, or in the factories and mills, which were setting up where children had to work in very dangerous conditions. The Brontes weren't rich, but they didn't have that threat hanging over them. So that's one reason. The other reason, a big reason, is there was a spring at Haworth Parsonage. They had their own clean water supply, which was a huge advantage to the parsonage compared to most of the rest of Haworth. So that's another reason why they survived cholera, typhus and typhoid. There were these epidemics that year by year would wipe out, that would decimate. Take 1 in 10 as a decimate means. It would wipe out the population of Haworth. So Brontes survived that, but they died from consumption, tuberculosis, which is a major killer in England, but it wasn't a major killer in Haworth. So it's strange really that 5 in the family of the 6 should die of tuberculosis. We'll look at the reasons for that, and there is a reason, I think. very sad, tragic reason why it was consumption of tuberculosis, which destroyed the Haworth children. We'll look at that in another video. But if you go in Haworth graveyard, there are many beautiful, stunning, sad memorials. Perhaps the saddest of all, most moving of all, is for the Heaton children. And if you go around, you can't help but notice, if you look at the gravestones, people dying in their teens, people dying in their 20s, over and over and over again. And then it jumps up, you get people who are dying in their 60s and 70s, 80s, people like Patrick Bronte, who did live to old age. And I think it's if you made it past the childhood, there's deadly time. If you made it out of your teens, out of your 20s, by that time you're building up so much immunity to exposure to these diseases that you could then live what we'd see today as a normal lifespan. But a lot of people didn't get that opportunity. Joseph Heaton was a stonemason, carved lots of the graves in Haworth graveyard, and the most moving is one he did for his own family. And it's very moving. They were just wiped out, the human tragedy of it all. It says on the stone, this is from Great Book, by the way, Ghosts and Gravestones of Haworth by Philip Lister. There's some amazing stories in here of ghosts, whether you believe ghosts or not. There's some fascinating stories, but also about some of the people who are buried in Haworth graveyard, including the Heaton family. So this stone, it's a beautiful big stone near the church. If you go and visit, sacred to is what it says, sacred to the memory of James William, son of Joseph and Elizabeth Heaton of Haworth, who died in the first year of his age. Also 3 infants of theirs, not even named, the infants died as babies. Also James Whittam, their son, died July 19th, 1878, in the 2nd year of his age. Also Elizabeth, their daughter, who died June 19th, 1885, aged 6 weeks. Also an infant son of theirs, and again not named. Also of the above named Joseph Heaton, the mason, who died March 18th, 1914, in his 69th year. Also Elizabeth, his wife, who died April 22nd, 1917, in her 71st year. Sweet rest at last. What a tragic memorial. I'm sorry for getting so moved. I always do it at things like this, but it's such a, it's just names on stone now. But it's such a tragic human story. And at the bottom of this great monument that he's designed and made for his own children, none of whom lived to adulthood, he's designed at the bottom, there's a little infant baby, with his head resting on a stone pillow forever. So it's very moving, I think. And Haworth Churchyard is very moving. Those children never got a chance. The Brontes, thankfully, lived beyond the average life expectancy, and that gave them a chance to write the amazing books which will always live on. That's their main memorials. We've got a memorial in Haworth Church. Anne Bronte is buried in Scarborough Graveyard. Memorials that people visit, but their real memorials are the amazing books, like Wuthering Heights, like Viet, like Agnes Grey, these amazing books. That's their real memorials, not in stone, memorials in paper. So let's always remember the talent, the genius of the Brontes, but let's also remember the Heaton children. Let's also remember people's lives lost, whose names we don't know. Let's remember Patrick Bronte and Charles Herschel Babbage, because of their work together, lives, thousands of lives, were saved. So I hope you can join me for another House of Bronte video. If you like this, like, subscribe. They won't all be as sad as this. I won't get emotional as often as this. You know, my stepdaughter said I get too emotional, I'm a wet wipe. That might be true, but I'll try to have less wet wipe behaviour in future House of Bronte videos. So thank you for joining me. Like and subscribe, and come back to find out more from the House of Bronte. Thank you.